Hello everyone, thanks for tuning in. I'm Sam Moser and this is my second van conversion. This one is a Sprinter 144 high roof. Let's jump right in with a detailed walkthrough of the build. I started by building the subfloor. First, I cut and laid out these wooden slats. Putting the slats widthwise allows them to rest on all the high points of the floor and create a level surface. Next, I lined up 3 sheets of rigid foam insulation outside and laid the flooring that came with the van on top to use as a template to mark and cut the foam to the shape of the floor. You can cut rigid foam by scoring it with a utility knife and then snapping it. I tested the fit of pieces inside and then moved the slats so they were laying on top of the insulation. Using 2 tape measures, I carefully aligned the slats so they were even and all spaced 16 inches on center. 1/2-inch plywood will go over the bottom layer of insulation and slats. By laying out the slats 16 inches on center, all the joints between the plywood panels above can be supported by a slat. I marked the location of each slat onto the foam and then cut the foam along these lines. Now, I can test fit it again with the foam sitting in between the slats. I should note that I had to cut the slats to be the same thickness as the rigid foam. Next, I laid out my 3 sheets of 1/2-inch plywood, then laid my template out again. But I couldn't just cut based on the template. I wanted to be sure that each seam between the pieces of plywood would sit centered on a slat. So I laid all my foam and slats on top and lined everything up properly. Now I could trace the outline with a Sharpie, move all this out of the way, and then cut the plywood. I test fit the plywood pieces before moving to the next step. At this point, I had all the subfloor pieces cut and began to prep the van's floor for gluing everything down. The first thing I needed to do was fill the bolt holes that were in the floor, and I still had the original bolts, so I just put these back in. I added thread lock to the threads of each, as well as a little sealant under the head of the bolt to make sure all of them were sealed up and wouldn't back out over time. Using an angle grinder with a paint stripping disc, I ground off the paint on the points where the wood slats make contact with the floor. This is where I'll be adding marine adhesive. I wanted the adhesive to stick to the floor as best as possible, and I think it'll adhere to the roughed up metal better than to smooth paint. After this, I vacuumed and swept the floor. I then began gluing down the floor. I started with the middle section. I first cleaned the floor with a rag and some isopropyl alcohol, making sure the bare metal spots were particularly clean for best adhesion. Denatured alcohol would have worked as well. Just make sure whatever you use to clean the floor is compatible with the adhesive you use next. I then applied generous globs of marine adhesive and then put the slat in place. Squished it into the adhesive and wiggled it around to make sure the adhesive spread around evenly. I used my finger to smear some of the extra adhesive over any bare spot of metal that was still showing at the edges to keep it protected from rust. I then put some dabs of adhesive down to hold the foam board in place, and then repeated the process for the next slat. Once I had all the pieces that go under the middle section of plywood in place, I put the plywood panel on top and then sat some heavy stuff on top to keep it held down while the adhesive cured. I then repeated this same sequence for the other floor sections. I let everything dry overnight, and the next day I glued down the 1/2-inch plywood. I used 2 different adhesives here. On the foam, I used the same marine adhesive and just applied it in dabs. I didn't go crazy with the adhesive. But where the plywood contacts the slats, I used wood glue, Titebond 3 in particular. I know from my woodworking that nothing is stronger for gluing wood to wood than wood glue, so I wanted to use that here. This may be overkill, but I wanted a super solid subfloor. The bond between the layers of subfloor will come from that glue, but adding fasteners to secure everything down while the glue dries is always a smart move. My original plan was to use screws for this, but on the fly I decided it'd be quicker and easier to use brad nails, so that's what I did. I should also note that I had marked the location of the slats on the top side of the plywood pieces, so I knew exactly where to put screws or brads. Since the brads don't have the same holding strength as screws, I used quite a lot of them. I also made sure to apply pressure, just with my foot, to the area of plywood before shooting the brads to make sure it was making solid contact. All this seemed to work great. I stayed off the floor until all the glue had cured, and the floor has felt solid ever since. The next thing I worked on was the insulation. Actually, I did a few other things before this, but I didn't record them. I installed a rooftop AC and a rooftop vent. Now for the insulation. I used Havelock wool. In the first van I did, I used 3M Thinsulate, and I still think Thinsulate is a solid product, but overall I favor Havelock wool now as my insulation of choice. The wool is a very natural and green product, and it's very easy to work with. It comes in 16-inch by 48-inch bats that are 2 inches thick and can be applied to the large sections of wall. The bats are easy to cut and tear into smaller pieces to fill different sized cavities. I used 3M spray adhesive to stick the insulation to the walls. The spray adhesive holds it up great, and once the wall paneling is in place, it'll be fully secured. In some of the deeper cavities, I added 2 layers of wool. But you want to make sure you aren't overstuffing it anywhere, as the wool needs to keep its natural loft to be effective. When using the spray adhesive, be sure to spray both the back of the wool and the surface you are applying it to. Then wait a quick bit for the adhesive to get tacky and then press it in place. This works and it holds it up even on the ceiling panels, but I added some temporary masking tape too, just in case anything started to fall. After covering the majority of the walls and ceiling, I started stuffing smaller chunks of wool into the nooks and crannies. Then I added wool inside the door panels. Don't forget other places like under the headliner above the cab. With the insulation in place, I started on the wall framing, or probably better referred to as furring. Before I cover all the general stuff, I want to call attention to a couple special areas, but I didn't get these on film. Along the sides here, I bolted this thicker board to the wall on each side. This will support the crossbars that create the bed platform. You'll see this later. To attach this, I installed plus nuts into holes in the walls and then bolted the board into the plus nuts. Additionally, I also had to create some reinforced framing to support the ceiling around the rooftop AC. Now for all the furring strips along the walls, the point of these is basically to create a continuous plane that the wall cladding will go on, as well as to have something other than the van's sheet metal to fasten the cladding to. I used 1x3 furring strips for most of this. I had to cut kerfs into the longer vertical pieces to help them bend to the curves of the van wall. I attached all of these furring strips with some self-drilling construction screws. Plus nuts and bolts could also be used for this, but using screws makes it much easier to install these furring strips, and they are plenty strong. For extra strength, you could put in adhesive such as Sikaflex behind the furring strips. I did some experiments on a few different construction screws and self-tapping screws, and I found some that worked best. Typical self-tapping sheet metal screws have fairly fine threads, and I found that these would strip easily. The screws that I found worked best had threads that were a bit coarser. With most of the furring strips in place, I ran the wiring. I find it easiest to do this after the furring strips are in place, so you have something to secure the wires to, and so you know you aren't putting wires in the way of your furring. Kind of like how in a home you run the electrical after all the studs are in. I used a couple different types of wire. For the DC circuits, I ran either 14 gauge duplex or 12 gauge duplex. 14 gauge for the lower current devices like lights, and 12 gauge for higher current devices. Duplex means that the wire is actually a bundle of 2 wires, the negative and the positive. For the AC circuits, I ran 12 gauge triplex wiring. I like the marine duplex and triplex because the inner wires are protected by a strong outer sheath. It also has good stranded core wire. Be sure to always use stranded and not solid core wire in mobile applications. I built and painted this headliner shelf outside of the van and am installing it in place here. It's one complete piece that took a lot of scribing and test cuts to get it to fit just right. The lower part is supported by brackets as a headliner shelf would normally be. The top of the vertical face is screwed into the front roof rib of the van, altogether making this a super solid assembly. Next, I put up the ceiling cladding. For this, I'm using 1/4 inch thick pine tongue and groove paneling that I finished with polyurethane prior to installing. I think this type of cladding looks very nice, and at 1/4 inch it's fairly lightweight. I've seen photos of people installing thicker tongue and groove cladding in vans, and personally I don't think that's a great choice from a weight perspective. The cladding is attached to the furring strips bolted to the roof beams. It's attached with both glue and brad nails. For the glue, I used Titebond Thick and Quick. I like the Thick and Quick glue variation for this task because it doesn't run or drip as easily as normal wood glue. I debated over whether to go with glue and brad nails or screws and no glue, but in the end I decided on glue and brads. Installation is pretty straightforward this way, and once the glue dries, you have a really solid ceiling assembly. The only disadvantage to this route over using screws and no glue is you can't easily disassemble a portion or all of it later. Before doing the wall cladding, I needed to add some additional wall framing or support in a few areas. The first being around this window. I cut this piece from plywood, and it'll give a uniform surface for attaching all of the wall cladding to that'll go around the window. Then I added additional pieces in the walls anywhere that an outlet was going to be mounted or that I felt would benefit from additional support behind the 1/4 inch tongue and groove paneling. For the most part, this additional framing was made from 1/2 inch plywood that I screwed in between the furring strips using pocket hole screws. I also framed out a section of wall on either side where I was going to be adding a cubby in the wall. You'll see this later. At this point, I was ready to start installing the wall cladding. The process for this was basically the same as for the ceiling. Again, I used glue and brad nails to attach the cladding to the furring strips and other bits of wall framing. Before putting the glue on the board, I would hold it up to the spot it was going to go and mark where it would make contact with the wood behind it. I only applied glue in those areas. Then, I would fit it in place and shoot some brad nails in. For the walls, I installed the wood as is and then painted it once installed. When going across the big open areas, such as the cubby opening or window, I put a few boards all the way across to make sure my alignment was staying even on both sides. Once one side was done, I repeated the process on the other side. After this, I moved my focus to the lower part of the walls. I assembled boxes around the wheel wells. The bottom of the wheel well box was both glued and pocket hole screwed into the subfloor. I then filled the box with insulation and put a lid on it. The shape of the wheel wells can be awkward to build around and insulate, so I like the approach of boxing them in and filling the void with insulation. For the remainder of the lower sections, I cut out wall panels from 1/8 inch plywood and screwed these into the furring strips. This lower part of the wall is all going to be either under the bed or behind cabinets, so I just wanted a lightweight panel to cover these areas, and the 1/8 inch plywood worked well. Now I began getting the walls prepped for painting. The first thing I needed to do is clean up the edges of the cladding around the various openings where I didn't cut it precisely and it was overhanging. To do this, I first roughly cut off the excess with the jigsaw, and then I trimmed it flush with a router and a flush cut bit. The ceiling had some boards that needed to be cut too, and I also did that at this time. Next, I cleaned up my dust, taped off all the areas I didn't want to paint, and sprayed my first coat. After the first coat, I went through and filled all the nail holes and other imperfections with wood filler. Then, I sanded the walls before spraying the next coat. I sanded in between each coat of paint. As tedious as this gets, it really is important for getting a smooth finish. I then wired in the ceiling lights and hooked them up to a temporary battery. This became really handy because now I had light inside the van without having to bring in a portable light on a stand. Flooring time! I started by vacuuming off the floor and then cutting and laying out my first few rows of flooring. Here I'm using vinyl plank flooring. The planks click and lock together with a tongue and groove sort of profile along the edges. It takes a few whacks with a mallet to get the pieces fully locked together. Along with the mallet, there's a special little chunk of rubber you need to protect the edges of the flooring planks from getting damaged by the mallet. I think it's called a tapping block. Once the individual flooring planks are locked together, they form a waterproof surface. Let me give a quick rundown on what I do and don't like about vinyl plank flooring and why I chose it for this build. I'll start with what I don't like. I don't love that it's made from vinyl. Vinyl is a very durable product, but the production of it isn't very environmentally friendly. It does have a lot going for it though. It's durable, comes in a variety of styles, waterproof, easy to clean, thin, and easy to cut with just normal tools. This van isn't mine, it was a commissioned build for a client. Given that, I wanted to install a flooring that was durable and would last a long time without needing upkeep or giving them trouble. That's why I chose this flooring. In the future and for personal projects, I'd like to explore more eco-friendly flooring options. Cork and bamboo come to mind. Next, I installed the outlet boxes and electrical receptacles in the walls. All of the 110-volt outlets are on this side of the van. With a dedicated outlet for an induction cooktop and a few others needed in specific places, there ended up being quite a few outlets on this wall considering it's such a small space. In a van, all outlets should be GFCI protected. This doesn't necessarily mean every outlet needs to be a GFCI outlet, because if multiple are chained together, then only the first one needs to be GFCI and the others down the line can be a normal receptacle but are protected by the GFCI at the start of the chain. In some cases, the inverter used in your electrical system may already have a GFCI built in, so outlet selection and AC wiring can vary a lot depending on your system and requirements. After this, I finished the interior portion of the rooftop air conditioner install. The AC I installed on the roof was the Dometic Brisk Air 2. The interior portion I'm installing here is called the air distribution box. I waited till now to complete the air conditioner install because you can't fully install the AC until the finished ceiling is up. Next, I turned my attention towards building the bed platform. So like I said before, earlier on I bolted these 2x4 boards to either wall to act as rails to support crossbars, forming a bed platform. For the crossbars, I'm going to use aluminum and not wood, 1.5-inch square aluminum tubing. I wanted the top of the crossbars to sit flush with the top of the side rails, so I cut out square notches into the wood for the metal bars to sit in. That's what I've been doing so far in this video clip. My process for cutting out these notches went as follows. I first made a template from a scrap of plywood with the shape of the notch I needed to make. I then screwed the template onto the location I wanted to cut. Then I used an oscillating multi-tool to roughly cut out the shape of the notch. Next, I used my router with a template bit to shape the notch to the exact shape of the template, so it would be a perfect fit with the aluminum crossbar. The only issue here is that the router leaves the bottom corners round. So as the last step, I used the chisel to square up the bottom corners. Then I unscrewed the template and moved on to the next one. Once all the notches were cut, I was able to cut the aluminum crossbars to their final widths and test fit them. Everything fit, but it was at this point I realized I bought enough aluminum for 6 bars, but marked and cut 7 notches on each side. So in this clip there's no bar in the spot closest to the rear doors, as I would need to get one more crossbar. 1/2-inch plywood will go over these bars later to complete the bed platform. At this point I created a trim piece to dress up this rear door area. Areas like this can be tricky to cut pieces that fit seamlessly. So let me walk you through the approach I took for this one. To establish the outer profile, I split the area into 5 segments and scribed and fit a piece of plywood in each segment. I didn't get a clip of this, but each piece took a bit of cutting and recutting or fine-tuning to get the fit right. The purpose of these 5 pieces is essentially to create a template. I then detached these pieces and laid them out all together on one large sheet of plywood. Once they were positioned just right, I traced the outline. I then cut the piece with the jigsaw. At this point, I was just trying to establish the outside profile, and I left the inside profile oversized. Once it was cut, I did a test fit. It was a bit of a squeeze to get it in place, but I liked the fit. I now used a pencil and traced the inside profile by following along the metal edges of the van's doorway, doing this from the back side of the trim piece. The inside was much simpler to trace than the outside. After tracing, I pulled the piece out and cut along this line with the jigsaw. With these kinds of cuts, it's good to cut a little bit outside of your line, since you can remove more material later but not add more. Also, since jigsaw cuts can end up a bit wavy, it can be good practice to stay just outside the line and then use a sander to remove the last bit of material. That was about it for this piece. The last thing I did was pre-drill and countersink some holes for screwing it into place. I waited to fully attach it though, as I still plan to remove it for painting before final installation. After this, I started to build and fit the interior cabinets and structure. Prior to this, I had already started constructing some of the cabinets outside the van. My cabinet construction generally consists of using 1/2-inch plywood that's connected with glue and pocket hole screws. Brad nails instead of pocket hole screws in some areas too. A little later in this video, I'll show a better example of the construction of one of my cabinets. At this point in the build, I turned my attention toward the van's electrical system, starting with deciding how the batteries would sit and building a tray for securing them. After that, I built the enclosure for the water tank, which would also be located here. And then I began to mount the other components and then began to start to wire everything together. The electrical system for this van consists of 3 100 amp hour lithium iron phosphate batteries, a 2000 watt inverter charger, 400 watts of solar on the roof charging from a combined solar and alternator charge controller. A deep dive into the electrical system isn't in the scope of this video. I'll do a deep dive about the design and schematic of this electrical system in a future video. I built all the cabinets in this van, basically the same as in my last van. The main material here is 1/2-inch Baltic birch plywood. This has been and remains my favorite plywood for cabinets. It has a ton of thin layers, all made of birch, and it's very stable. It cuts well and is generally free of voids in the inner plies. What I've done so far in this clip is use glue and brad nails to attach these vertical dividers to this long front face of the cabinet. Here's a test fit and look at what this cabinet is for. It's a bedside nook, or a long thin set of cubbies along the side wall down the whole length of the bed platform. Next, I cut some supports for the backside. These are strips of 1/2-inch plywood, same as the rest of the cabinet. I drilled holes for pocket hole screws into each end of these strips. These are also glued along with the pocket hole screws. Before screwing them in, I used a clamp to hold them in place in the correct position so they wouldn't move when I drove the screws, as pocket hole screws tend to do. That was about it for this little cabinet shell. Later, I'll add a lid to each section using wood that matches the countertop. Here I'm adding some trim pieces to cover the gap between the wall and ceiling cladding. I painted these prior to installing. To secure these, I'm driving screws through the board and into the furring strips behind the cladding. Now, I'll install the now painted rear trim piece that I showed how I cut earlier. I then added some 1/8-inch plywood that I could bend to the curve of the rear opening to create a seamless transition. This plywood was thin enough to bend to even the tight curve at the top of the doorway. I used glue and brad nails to fasten this piece into the edge of the rear trim piece I installed just before this. This back corner under the bed houses a lot of the pieces of the water system. Mounted to the wall we have the pump and accumulator, and the unit on the floor is a small 12-volt hot water heater. A rundown of the water system would be beyond the scope of this video, so I'll cover that in a future video. At this point, everything is really starting to come together. Here, I'm continuing to build out the interior structure with 1/2-inch plywood. Next, I worked on the countertop. Prior to this, I had done 2 things. First was to secure this cabinet into the wall and subfloor of the van. Second was to cut out the sink and cooktop openings in the countertop. As I was test fitting it here, I found that I needed to trim some of the back corner of the countertop to get it to fit properly around to the window frame. On this main cabinet unit here, I added some horizontal strips. These were primarily needed to support the locking drawer latches I was going to be using for the cabinet drawers and door. Now, back to the bed platform. Up until this point, I hadn't actually secured the crossbars of the bed platform in place. I did this now, using some construction adhesive at the ends where the bars fit into the notches in the beams on the side. I also needed to trim away a little bit of the vertical pieces in the center under the beams here so they could all sit all the way into the notches. So I'm doing that here as well. That part could have been avoided if I hadn't cut these vertical pieces just a hair too tall by accident, but sometimes you measure a little wrong. I made these little cubbies to add some little shelves for books and small items and to create a spot to mount some of the control panels. Here I'm securing the cubbies into the wall, using some screws that go through the sidewalls of the cubby into some of the wall framing. After this, I mounted the upper cabinets. These are secured with construction screws that go through the frame of the cabinet, through the furring strips in the wall, and through to the metal ribs of the van. I didn't use them in this instance, but hanging upper cabinets is a good use for plus nuts and bolts as well. Then, I brought the bedside cabinet in and installed the hinges for the lids. Now, I'm installing the hinges on the upper cabinets. I had fit and installed the hinges on these upper cabinets outside the van before painting them. I recommend installing hinges before painting because then if you mess up and need to patch any holes, it's easier before you've painted or finished them. This last part of the build was a bit of a time crunch, so I didn't get the most thorough footage. Now, I'm installing the slatted plywood that forms the bed platform over the crossbars. I used some construction adhesive to secure this down. Remember to leave slats for airflow on your bed platform so that moisture doesn't get trapped under the mattress and lead to mold. Under the sink, I needed to run the last bit of PEX to feed the sink faucet. After this, I was ready to put in the countertop, which by this point I had finished with a water-based polyurethane. The countertop is secured with screws that go through the cabinet and into the underside of the countertop. Then, I mounted and wired in some under-cabinet LED light strips. Finally, I mounted the doors on the upper cabinets, and that was just about it. Alright, let's go for a little tour and see the rest all put together. Thank you so much for watching. Take care.